We welcome you back to this channel. Today we will explore paranormal encounters during the night. These experiences will remind us that the night can hide more than we imagine. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
In the fog.
I was never a fearful person. Night walks were my way of disconnecting from daily stress. The silence of the night, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the leaves, gave me an indescribable peace. But one night, that calm was shattered by something I still can't explain. I like to try different paths, and that night was no exception. I took a trail that led into a small forest on the edge of the city. I had heard stories about that place, rumors about people who had gotten lost or seen strange things, but I never paid them any attention. I never believed in those kinds of stories. It was a foggy night, so it didn't surprise me that the mist obscured the end of the path. It felt as if I were stepping into another world. The shadows of the trees stretched and twisted, forming strange shapes on the ground. Every step I took crunched over dry leaves, and there was something in the air that made me think I wasn't alone. As I continued, the fog thickened, and soon I realized I couldn't see the beginning of the path. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. My breathing quickened, and I realized I was walking faster than usual. That's when I saw it. It was a dark figure at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just another shadow. I turned slightly to get a better look, and the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a normal shadow. It was denser, darker. It was a tall being covered by a cloak of fog. It stood still, about 10 meters from me, right in the middle of the path. It looked human, but had no defined shape. I definitely wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself that it was just a tree, caused by the dim lights of the path and the fog. Something inside me screamed to get away, to turn around and run. But on the other hand, I didn't want to give in to the stories I had heard, so I didn't move. I stayed there, paralyzed, trying to understand what I was seeing. And then, the figure moved. It wasn't a sudden movement, but slow, almost lazy, as if it were dragging itself along the path and through the fog. It slid toward me, closing the distance between us with a calmness that was disturbing. I couldn't see a face or eyes, but I felt its gaze, an invisible pressure that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in that moment, like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The figure stopped just a few meters from me, and in that instant, everything changed. I could see its face. It had a look that didn't seem of this world, with small eyes and a macabre smile forming on its mouth, revealing yellowed, sharp teeth. It seemed as if time had stopped until I felt a gust of icy wind sweep over me, bringing with it a whisper. It wasn't an ordinary whisper, but a sort of incoherent murmur, a mix of voices that seemed to come from everywhere. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Hatred, rage, despair. Panic completely overtook me. I took a step back, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the ground. The figure remained there watching me, and now that I was on the ground, it seemed even taller and more imposing. The whispers grew louder. I felt like my head was going to explode, like those voices were getting inside my mind, tearing at my sanity. With superhuman effort, I managed to stand up and started to run. I ran without looking back, with my heart pounding in my ears and my legs trembling with terror. The whispers followed me, chasing me like a shadow, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the forest and returned to the road. The fog dissipated almost immediately, and the cold air gave way to a soft breeze, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in me. I never went back to that forest, nor did I ever walk at night again. What I saw, what I felt, left invisible scars, memories that still haunt me in the darkness. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that shadow staring at me with those terrifying eyes, and a shiver runs down my spine when I think, what would have happened if I hadn't run?
What happened to me in that small town, far from the bustle of the city, is something I still struggle to accept. It was a place that seemed trapped in time. The houses were old, the streets were narrow and cobbled, lit only by a couple of lanterns that emitted a faint light. I'm a journalist, and I went there for work, something related to local history, something that doesn't really matter to recall. After having spent some time researching and interviewing the people in the area, I decided to take a walk as night fell, a walk that changed my life. I had finished my business earlier than expected, and since I wasn't in a hurry to return to the hotel, I decided to explore the town on foot. The night air was cool, and the tranquility of the place was oddly comforting. The streets were deserted, and the only sound accompanying me was the echo of my own footsteps on the stones. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice how the night seemed to grow darker the further I moved from the town center. The houses were spaced farther apart, and the lanterns were scarce. That was when I saw it for the first time. At first, I thought it was just my shadow, distorted by the flickering light of a lantern far away. But when the light finally went out, that dark figure remained. It wasn't my shadow. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I stopped trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure, more of a dark blot than a defined shape, seemed to float a few meters from me. It had no clear contours, but its presence was undeniable. It moved slightly. I realized it wasn't the wind causing the chills I felt. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of light and shadow. But when I took a step back, the figure moved too. It wasn't following me. It was stalking me. Fear began to settle in my chest. I wanted to run, but something told me not to turn my back on it. With a lump in my throat, I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadow. But no matter how far I moved, the figure didn't disappear. It kept getting closer and closer. I quickened my pace, trying to return to the town center. The figure drew nearer. I could now see its almost human shape more clearly. It was tall, with longer than usual legs, and it seemed to glide effortlessly over the stones. It was as dark as if it were part of the night itself. Finally, I turned a corner, hoping to lose sight of the shadow, but what I saw around the corner only made my fear intensify. The street was completely dark, the lanterns were off, and the only light came from the moon. I felt the shadow sliding behind me, almost touching me. Without thinking twice, I started to run, my heart pounding in my chest and my breath burning my throat. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadow followed me, always at the same distance, always present. It seemed to mock my efforts to escape, feeding on my desperation. I reached a deserted square where the only lit lantern cast a faint light on a wooden bench. I stopped there, panting, and looked around, expecting to see the shadow appear again. But there was nothing. Only silence and darkness. I thought I had gotten rid of it, that it had all been a product of my imagination. But when I turned to leave the square, I saw it. It was so close that I could feel the cold emanating from it. I could see its face. Its eyes were black and deep. It had no mouth. It was as if that shadow wanted to absorb my soul. I was petrified. I didn't know what to do. I remember taking a deep breath and letting out a scream, the loudest scream I've ever given in my life. The shadow breathed in my ear and disappeared. An old woman whom I had interviewed that morning approached me. She said she had been looking for me. She had forgotten to tell me that no one should go out after dark. Everyone in the town knows that shadows stalk the night. The next day, I returned to the city. On the way back, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced. Without a doubt, what happened marked my life and made me see things differently. After that experience, I no longer go out at night, not even in my own city. I can't stop feeling like I'm being watched. I believe something came back with me and is hiding in the shadows, stalking me.
The shortcut.
I worked as a night shift assistant in the city center. Every night, I would return home by the same route. One night, after a long shift, I decided to change my usual routine. There was a narrow alley that passed behind some abandoned buildings, a shortcut I had never taken. There was something about that shortcut that made me slightly uneasy, as if there was a persistent shadow enveloping it. As I ventured into the alley, the silence grew denser, heavier. The lights were dim. The wind blew softly, whispering between the empty buildings like distant voices. As I continued, I noticed that the walls of the buildings seemed closer than I had realized before, narrowing the path. It was a strange feeling. A creak behind me made me stop abruptly. I turned my head sharply but saw nothing, just the empty street. I took a deep breath and told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I forced myself to move forward, but with every step, the feeling of being watched grew, as if something or someone was following me, right on my heels. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, a soft and distant voice but clear enough to chill my blood. It was undoubtedly the voice of a little girl, almost melodious, but laden with deep sadness. "Why did you leave?" The whisper made me stop dead in my tracks. I looked around, searching for the source of the voice, but I saw nothing, only shadows and more shadows. Fear took hold of me. I knew I couldn't stand there. I decided to quicken my pace, but every time I tried to move forward, I heard the voice again, louder each time. Terrified, I started to run, but I felt something on my leg, like a cold, weak, and small hand trying to stop me. I stumbled and fell to the ground, scraping the palms of my hands. When I looked up, I saw her. In front of me, in the middle of the alley, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her hair was long and black, partially covering her face. She wore a white dress, dirty and torn. But what struck me the most were her eyes. They were two dark wells, full of sadness and despair. The girl was staring at me. Her lips moved, releasing a childlike sob, as if she were searching for someone. I tried to get up, but suddenly the girl appeared in front of me, bringing her face close to mine, reaching out her hand toward mine. In her eyes was such immense sadness that it overwhelmed me, and I let a few tears escape. I felt the air around me grow colder, almost freezing, and once again those words echoed. "Why did you leave?" The voice repeated in my mind, over and over. Fear paralyzed me. I felt her small, pale hand with thin fingers touch mine. A wave of intense cold filled the air at that moment, and the abandoned buildings seemed to close in on me. At that moment, I remembered hearing a story at work related to the girl I saw. Many years ago, a family lived in one of the buildings, now abandoned, that lined the alley. The mother, for no apparent reason, had abandoned her young daughter there and never returned. The girl died of hunger and cold, waiting in vain for her mother's return. Many claimed that her spirit wandered the alley, searching for answers, searching for her mother. I don't know how I managed to get up and run, but before reaching the end of the alley, I looked back and saw the girl in the distance, watching as she was abandoned once again. A sadness I can't describe washed over me, but the fear was greater, and I kept running until I reached my house. The next day, I woke up thinking it had all been a bad dream, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. However, when I looked down, I saw the scratches on my hands from the fall. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Her image was etched in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see her standing there, waiting for someone to come for her. I tried to return to my usual routine, but the alley was always there. I could feel the girl's voice resonating in the back of my mind. I decided to change jobs, to somehow distance myself from that memory, but I can't forget what I experienced. Some nights, when the wind whispers, I can hear the girl's voice again, asking, "Why did you leave?"
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, Give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.